On the morning of the St. Luke's Summer Garden Fete, St. Mary Mead Below looked as though it had been carefully arranged by a pair of particularly fussy angels. The sky was a polite English blue, clouds drifting like shuffled lace. The lawns around the vicarage had been scalped and coaxed into submission, and the flower beds glowed with the desperate, overachieving colors of a village determined to look prosperous, even if it was not. From 10 o'clock onwards, people began to arrive in sensible shoes and Sunday-best hats, drifting through the garden gate in 2s and 3s, bearing cakes and preserves, and the deep or sort of determined cheerfulness that comes from years of practice. Children were shepherded away from the more fragile displays. Gentlemen were inveigled into carrying trestle tables, and an atmosphere of restrained festivity settled like fine dust. Miss Jane Marple, in a hat that had once been quite fashionable and a dress of unremarkable navy, sat in a folding chair near the tea tent, her knitting bag at her feet. She had tried to be persuaded by Mrs. Price Ridley into supervising the bottle stall. "You have such a calm manner, Miss Marple, so very helpful with really quite excitable people," but had declined with that gentle obstinacy the village had long since learned not to argue with. "Oh no," she had said mildly. "One sees much more from a distance, don't you think? And at my age, dear Mrs. Price Ridley, one is so easily confused among all those labels." Now she watched. Not ostentatiously, never that, but with the faint, pleased interest of an elderly woman content to be entertained. Here, a quarrel, half hidden under the cover of arranging scones. There, a too bright greeting hiding resentment. And over by the coconut shy, a young couple looking anywhere but at one another. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, was every bit as vigorous as the bishop's scarlet geraniums. The focal point of the morning was the opening ceremony, which, tradition dictated, required a person of some consequence. This year the honor fell to Colonel Geoffrey Arbuthnot, late of the Indian Army, newly retired to the laurels, and already a subject of much discussion. "Quite the distinguished addition to the village," Mrs. Bantry had remarked, not entirely approvingly. "Though I do think one ought not to have a mustache quite that commanding unless one is in a pantomime." Colonel Arbuthnot arrived to the minute, as one might expect. He cut a brisk figure in a well-pressed blazer, his white hair disciplined as rigidly as his spine, his famous moustache bristling with purpose. On his arm, though not quite comfortably, was his much younger second wife, Madeleine, delicate, prettily nervous, and rather overdressed for a village fete, in Miss Marple's view. "They make a curious pair," Miss Marple thought, as she watched the colonel detach himself briskly to confer with the vicar and the fete committee. Madeleine Arbuthnot remained by the tea tent, fingers worrying the clasp of her handbag, her eyes moving quickly from one group to another and never quite resting. "Such a dear, but high-strung," murmured Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, bustling past with a plate of sausage rolls. "Of course, there's been talk. Second marriages, you know how people are. They say his first wife left him unexpectedly well off." "Money is often unexpected," Miss Marple replied placidly, "particularly by those who inherit it." The program for the morning, printed at some expense and with several spelling mistakes, declared that at precisely 11 o'clock, Colonel Arbuthnot would declare the fete open, from the small wooden platform near the Rose Arch. Immediately afterwards, there would be a demonstration by the same Luke's Handbell Society, whose performance of Jerusalem was confidently expected to last exactly 3 minutes. 3 minutes is quite long enough for Jerusalem on handbells, observed Mr. Stringer, the church organist, to anyone who would listen. At a few minutes to 11, a subtle rearrangement of the crowd took place. People abandoned stalls and conversations with the resigned air of those prepared to be ceremonious. Children were shepherded to the front, wiped perfunctorily with handkerchiefs. Miss Marple's chair afforded an excellent side view of the platform, and she, too, turned her attention towards it. The colonel mounted the 2 steps with military briskness, pausing only to salute an old comrade from the village, Major Weston, who leaned on a stick and wore his medals, it must be admitted, somewhat too prominently. Madeline fluttered beside the platform, then retreated hastily under the rose arch as Miss Price. Ridley hissed something about blocking the view. "Ladies and gentlemen," called the vicar, brown and earnest, his voice carrying more easily than one might have expected from his mild appearance. "If I might have your attention, we are honored today that Colonel Arbuthnot has agreed to open our fete. He has served his country with distinction." "Dash it, Clement," the colonel interrupted good-humoredly, leaning towards the microphone. "They haven't come to hear my biography." There was a ripple of laughter. Miss Marple's eyes, however, were not on the colonel. She was looking at Madeline, who had withdrawn to the side of the vicarage, half in shadow. Another woman had joined her, tall, striking, with carefully waved dark hair and a dress that looked, to Miss Marple's experienced eye, distinctly London. Mrs. Vivian Harcourt, the colonel's widowed niece, recently arrived to stay. The two women stood very close together, speaking quickly. Madeline's hand gripped the other's wrist. Miss Harcourt's mouth was set in a thin, controlling line. Then, as though feeling herself observed, Mrs. Harcourt looked up and her gaze met Miss Marple's. For a fraction of a second, something sharp flashed there. Sharp, assessing, almost hostile. Then she smiled, a wide, easy smile, and raised her hand in a little wave. Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression pleasantly vacant. Inside, a small, familiar instinct pricked. There was something there. Something not quite as it should be. "And so," Colonel Arbuthnot was saying heartily, "I declare this fete open." He brought his hand down in a decisive chopping motion as the crowd dutifully clapped. Immediately, the vicar gestured to the cluster of eager, sweating men and women clutching handbells of various sizes. "The St. Luke's Handbell Society will now favor us," he announced, "with Jerusalem." 3 minutes, Colonel," he added, smiling. "We've timed it." 3 minutes is all a man needs for a decisive action," the colonel replied cheerfully. "In battle, that is." The first chime rang out, clear and oddly plaintive in the warm air. The players bent and straightened, their faces solemn with concentration. The music wove itself over the crowd, familiar and slightly comic. For 3 minutes, the attention of St. Mary Mead was fixed, more or less, on the handbells. People shifted, whispered, smiled. Children grew restive. A dog barked once and was sternly silenced. Miss Marple sat very still, her hands folded on her lap, listening. At the final note, slightly off but enthusiastically achieved, there was another round of applause. The bell ringers relaxed, laughing. The vicar stepped forward again. Thank you. Most inspiring. And now, Colonel." The colonel did not move. He was still standing where he had been, one hand resting lightly on the rail of the platform. His head had dropped a little forward, as though in thought. The bristling moustache no longer bristled. It drooped faintly. "Colonel," repeated the vicar, a note of uncertainty creeping into his voice. From somewhere in the crowd, a woman laughed, too loudly. Someone else shushed her irritably. It was Mrs. Harcourt who moved first. She pushed her way to the front with an air of determined deficiency and mounted the steps. "Uncle Geoffrey," she said sharply, "you're not being funny, are you?" She laid a hand on his arm. Then her face altered, her grip tightened, and she gave a little cry, half shock, half outrage. "Fetch a doctor," she called, her voice suddenly shrill. He's not well." There was a moment, just a second or two, of complete stillness, of blank astonishment, like the pause between lightning and thunder. Then sound broke over the garden. Shouts, gasps, hurried, disjointed questions. Miss Marple, who had risen more slowly than the others, watched the turmoil with grave, faded blue eyes. She saw Madeline Arbuthnot, white as the tablecloths in the tea tent, one hand pressed to her mouth. She saw Major Weston forcing his way through the crowd with unexpected agility, his stick jabbing indiscriminately. She saw the vicar's wife begin to cry quietly. From shock, and from a sense, perhaps, of some dreadful impropriety. And she saw very distinctly the handbell conductor glance at his watch, frown and murmur to the organist. Exactly 3 minutes. Exactly. Miss Marple's hands, folded on the head of her walking stick, tightened almost imperceptibly. 3 minutes, she repeated softly to herself. Such a very little time. And yet, so often, quite long enough. For a moment, the scene on the church green dissolved into a blur of movement and broken voices. People surged toward the vestry, then held back in frightened fascination, like villagers at the edge of a fire. Somewhere, a child began to wail. The handbells, hastily put down on a nearby table, gave a faint, melancholy jangle as someone brushed past them. Colonel Melchett, recovering most quickly, took up a commanding stance by the vestry door. "No one else inside," he snapped. "We don't want everything trampled over. Dr. Haydock's been sent for?" Yes, of course," stammered Reverend Clement, his face an unhealthy shade. Tommy, run and fetch Dr. Haydock immediately. Say it's urgent. Life and death." He hesitated, corrected himself miserably. Well, death. Miss Marple rose slowly, gathering up her knitting bag with a habitual neatness quite at odds with the tumult around her. She did not attempt to approach the vestry. She had no need to see the poor boy's body again. She had seen enough corpses in her time, and they were all much alike in the end. What interested her, as always, were the living. Near the refreshment tent, Mrs. Bantry was already in full flow, white with excitement yet oddly animated by it. "Struck down in the house of God. I always said there was something dramatic about that young man. Very intense eyes. Mark my words. There's a woman at the bottom of it." "There's already a woman at the bottom of it," sniffed Mrs. Price Ridley. His wife, running off to her sister like that, making scenes in the high street. That sort of thing never ends well. And now murder. Disgraceful. Miss Marple's ears, sharp even beneath the buzz of voices, caught a low exclamation from behind the jam store. Celia Forrester herself stood there, a little apart from the others, one gloved hand pressed to her lips. No one seemed certain whether to approach her or avoid her. Her face was quite colorless, but her eyes were fixed on the vestry door with a strange, rigid intensity. "He can't be dead," Celia said suddenly, to no one in particular. "Not David, not like that." It was, Miss Marple thought, the exact sort of thing people always said. It was not the words that mattered, but the way in which they were spoken. Celia's voice held horror. Yes, but something else too. Something like incredulity touched with a sharp, bewildered anger. Dr. Haydock arrived in his car a few minutes later, pushing through the onlookers with professional brusqueness. "Out of the way, all of you. I can't do my job with half of St. Mary Mead breathing down my neck." He glanced at Miss Marple as he passed, gave her a brief, wry nod, and vanished into the dimness of the vestry. There was a long, strained interval. The clock, newly started, Miss Marple thought, with a faint, grim irony, ticked with ponderous solemnity above the green. The hands moved forward, indifferent to the human dismay below. When Dr. Haydock emerged, he spoke quietly to Colonel Melchett and the vicar. But in a village, quiet conversations are like ripples in a pond. They spread outward, distorted yet irresistible. Within minutes, everyone knew what had been said. "He's been dead at least a quarter of an hour," Mrs. Bantry whispered to Miss Marple, her eyes round. "Isn't it dreadful? Killed during Jerusalem, of all things. Struck down between feet and chariot of fire." Miss Marple did not correct the timing, her own little watch, and her memory of Forrester's departure from the green agreed too exactly for doubt. A quarter of an hour? Well, doctors always allowed themselves a margin. In practical terms, the thing had happened in that compressed, curious interval when the whole village had been transfixed by the handbells. "Such a short time," murmured Miss Marple again. "And yet, time enough, if one were prepared." If one knew precisely when everyone would be looking the other way. Out loud she said only, "Poor boy, and poor Mrs. Forrester." Her eyes rested thoughtfully on Celia, who now stood quite alone, as though there were an invisible circle around her that no one dared to cross. "Of course," Mrs. Bantry breathed, lowering her voice to an eager hiss. "They'll say it was her. They always do when husbands are killed. You mark my words, Jane." Miss Marple's mild gaze did not leave Celia Forrester's pale, strained face. "Oh, yes," she said softly, "they will say it. The interesting question, Dolly dear, is whether they will be right." Inspector Slack regarded Celia Forrester with a look that was intended to be neutral and professional, but which contained, to Miss Marple's seasoned eye, a distinct air of anticipation. There was nothing, she reflected, that the official mind liked better than an obvious suspect. "You'll understand, madam," Slack said, flipping his notebook open, "that I need to know your movements this afternoon. Where were you at 3 o'clock? Celia swallowed. Her fingers tightened around the crumpled handkerchief. "By the jam store. I was there before the bells began, and I stayed there. You can ask Mrs. Bartlett. She was trying to sell me a jar of that dreadful rhubarb and ginger concoction." Several heads turned automatically toward Mrs. Bartlett, who flushed and nodded hastily. "She was, Inspector. I remember because the bells made me jump and I nearly dropped the change. Mrs. Forrester was right in front of me the whole time." Slack made a non-committal sound. "And before that, you had some sort of conversation with your husband, I gather?" Celia's composure thinned. A faint, brittle anger crept into her voice. "We exchanged a few words, yes. In public, Inspector, at a village fete. I hardly think I would choose that moment for a blazing row." "That remains to be seen," he replied. "What was said?" "We discussed money," she said flatly, "as half the village already knows. He'd fallen behind with several payments, rent, the piano, some other things. I told him I was tired of being made to look a fool. He said it would all be sorted out soon. Then he walked away, that's all." To Miss Marple, the words were almost less important than what lay around them. The fleeting look of contempt that crossed Celia's face when she mentioned being made to look a fool. The quick, almost involuntary glance toward Mr. Abbott, the church warden, who stood rigidly near the tea urn, his ruddy complexion now several shades paler than usual. Gossip, that inevitable byproduct of village life, had already begun to crystallize into firm opinions. Price Ridley, clearly believing herself helpful, drew nearer to Slack. "You know, Inspector, there was that unpleasantness about the check last month. The one that was, well, not quite what it should have been." Slack turned on her sharply. "What check, madam?" "Oh, I really couldn't say in detail," she said, in a tone that suggested she could say quite a lot indeed. "But I did hear that Mr. Forrester had some difficulty at the bank. Overdrawn or something of that nature. Mr. Finch from the High Street mentioned it. Quite distressed he was. Such things upset him." Miss Marple's mind, trained over many years in the observation of human frailties, filed this way among other fragments. Money troubles, marital discord, a public quarrel. Such things formed the familiar pattern of village tragedy. Yet the method of the crime, and especially its timing, felt curiously at odds with that tidy domestic narrative. A passion killing, she thought, seldom waits upon the striking of a clock or the beginning of a musical performance. Passion murders when it must, without regard for convenient 3-minute windows. Reverend Clement, looking more than usually flustered, approached Slack, hat in hand. "Inspector, if I might suggest, perhaps the church could be, cleared. It's most distressing for the ladies, and I fear the children. It'll be closed and locked, Vicar," Slack interrupted. "We'll have our scene of crime people down from Much Benham. Meanwhile, I'd appreciate it if everyone would stay nearby until I've taken your names and brief statements." People began to drift not far, but enough to form little knots of conversation under the trees. Miss Marple, with an appearance of mild vagueness, moved among them. She listened to Mrs. Bantry's breathless theories about jealous wives and secret affairs, to Mr. Abbott's stammering insistence that church finances were perfectly in order, absolutely sound, and to young Tommy Simons's excited, frightened account of opening the vestry door. "The handle was sticky, miss," he told her, eyes round. "I thought it was jam at first, but then I saw—" His face went greenish. "Mum says I mustn't talk about it. Makes things too real." "Sometimes, dear," Miss Marple said kindly, "things are quite real whether we talk about them or not." She patted his shoulder. "You went straight from your mother to the vestry, didn't you? No one stopped you on the way?" Tommy shook his head. "Everyone was looking at the bells. I could have done cartwheels and no one would have seen." Yes, thought Miss Marple quietly. That was exactly the point. As the police set up a makeshift desk by the tea tent, the new church clock chimed 3:30, its clear notes falling into the uneasy silence. Time had moved on, but somewhere in that neat little 3-minute slice of the afternoon, carefully framed by Jerusalem and the vicar's speech, lay the answer to David Forrester's death. And Miss Marple, clicking her needles once more, was determined to find it. Miss Marple did not return home until twilight had settled gently over St. Mary Mead. The fete, officially suspended rather than ended, trailed away in uneasy groups and hurried whispers. Stalls were left half-cleared, bunting drooped, uncollected, and the newly dedicated clock ticked on above the deserted green with calm, impersonal regularity. She walked back along the lane with Dolly Bantry, who, though visibly shaken, was also unmistakably invigorated by events. "Murder at the summer fete," Dolly said, half appalled, half thrilled. "It sounds like one of those lurid novels Arthur is always hiding from the staff." "I suppose you noticed everything, Jane?" "I noticed a good many things," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild. "Most of them quite ordinary, of course. It is so often the ordinary that proves most important." Dolly gave her a quick, shrewd look. "And what do you make of Celia? She didn't cry properly. One did feel she ought to cry." "There are different ways of being shocked, dear. Some people cry, some become hysterical, and some become very still indeed." Miss Marple's needles, which she had taken out as soon as she reached her cottage gate, clicked gently. "And sometimes people are angry, very angry, because something they thought they understood has suddenly changed." "You think she didn't expect David to die?" Dolly asked, then colored. "I mean, obviously not like that, but—" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That is precisely the point. There are quarrels that are familiar, almost comfortable. They go on for years. One does not truly imagine the quarrel ending, only continuing. Death is very abrupt." Inside her neat little parlor, with the canary politely subdued and the tea things laid out by faithful Florence, Miss Marple considered the day's events with the same quiet thoroughness she applied to her knitting patterns. 3 minutes, more or less, while Jerusalem rang out. A vestry with 2 doors, one internal, one apparently locked. A missing key. A young man with money-lending tendencies and a reputation for charm, perhaps rather more charm than solidity. A separated wife under public suspicion. A church warden with debts and a pawn ticket. It all had the air of something rehearsed. The next morning, Mary Mead woke to a fog of speculation thicker than any autumn mist. By 10 o'clock it was generally accepted, thanks largely to Mrs. Price Ridley, that Celia Forrester had almost certainly done it, though how she had contrived to leave the crowd unseen during the performance was admittedly a difficulty. Miss Marple heard this pronouncement while selecting biscuits in the High Street grocer's. "Of course it's Celia," Mrs. Price Ridley declared triumphantly. There was that dreadful scene at the post office, and she looked positively white with rage when he walked off before the ceremony. "Mark my words, it's always the wife." "The wife? Or the person everyone agrees must be the wife?" Miss Marple said gently, examining a tin of custard creams. "In my experience, Mrs. Price Ridley, when suspicion settles too quickly, it is often because the truth has taken care to step aside." At the post office, Miss Hartnell contributed further embroidery. He'd been lending money to half the village, she confided across the counter. Charging interest too, the young shark. Abbott, certainly. And that new couple at the cottage beyond the spinney, the Wattersons. There was a registered letter from London, very official looking, and after that, Mrs. Watterson came in with her wedding ring missing and paid a large sum into her account. Really? Miss Marple's tone was politely incurious, which was usually when she was most interested. Such things have a way of entangling people. She saw the Wattersons themselves a little later, passing the green. He was dark, restless, with the uneasy energy of a man not at ease with village life. She was pale, pretty, with the strained brightness of someone trying very hard to appear cheerful. They both glanced at the church, and then quite distinctly, away from it. That afternoon, as Miss Marple deadheaded her roses, Reverend Clement came up the garden path, his usually benevolent face clouded. "I hoped you might spare me a few minutes, Miss Marple," he began. "Inspector Slack is quite determined. It's all very straightforward. Motive, opportunity, domestic quarrel. But I cannot feel satisfied." "No," Miss Marple said softly. "Nor am I." "The inspector insists no one could have reached the vestry in those 3 minutes without being seen," the vicar went on. "But you are watching the door." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "I was watching the door, Vicar. That is precisely what troubles me." The following morning brought with it a deceptive calm. Sunlight fell benignly across the churchyard, glinting off the new clock face that now presided over St. Mary Mead with serene indifference. Only those who knew villages well would have recognized the heightened brightness in people's voices, the slightly too careful cheerfulness that signaled tension beneath the surface. Miss Marple, on her way to place flowers on a neglected grave she'd taken a fancy to, paused near the vestry door. The police had done their work. The chalk marks had been washed away, but a faint brown stain lingered in the stone crevices. She did not look at it for long. Her attention instead fixed on something far more trivial. A single dead leaf, brittle and brown, lay near the base of the inner door. Curious, given the time of year. Most of the trees were in full summer foliage. She bent delicately, examining it without touching. Elm, she decided, and not from any tree in the churchyard, which was dominated by yews and a solitary beech. Footsteps crunched on the gravel behind her. Abbott, the church warden, started violently when he saw her. "Miss Marple, I didn't see you there. I was just coming to check the collection boxes." "Terrible business, all this. Simply terrible." His gaze flicked toward the vestry, then away again, almost guiltily. She smiled at him with gentle interest. "I was admiring how very tidy everything seems, Mr. Abbott. So little sign of disturbance. Though I did notice that leaf. Curious, don't you think?" He followed her gaze, then shrugged too quickly. "Blown in, I expect. Drafts everywhere in these old buildings." He fumbled with his keys, dropping them once before managing to select the right one. Of course, Miss Marple agreed vaguely. "And such a comfort, I'm sure, that the external vestry door was bolted as usual. It must be a great responsibility, looking after all the church's keys." His hand froze on the lock. For the briefest instant, his face wore the expression of a man standing at the edge of a precipice. Then it was gone. "The vicar keeps the main keys, Miss Marple. I only have the safe and collection box ones." His voice was stiff. "Now, if you'll excuse me." She let him go, content with the small, panicked flicker she had observed. People's expressions, she'd often found, were most revealing at the precise moment they believed their secrets might be exposed. By late afternoon, the village had its next morsel of scandal to chew on. Mrs. Bantry, calling in at Miss Marple's cottage with the innocent intention of returning a borrowed pattern book, could hardly contain herself. "You'll never guess, Jane. Inspector Slack has discovered that Celia Forrester visited a solicitor in Much Benham 3 weeks ago. About a separation agreement, so they say. And, oh, this is rich, she'd asked about life insurance. David had a policy for £200, apparently. How interesting, Miss Marple murmured, pouring tea. Celia has always struck me as a practical girl. If one is leaving a husband, one must consider finances. It is only sensible. But to ask about insurance before he's even dead? Mrs. Bantry protested. It looks bad, Jane. It really does. It looks convenient, Miss Marple corrected gently. There is often a difference. When her friend had left, Miss Marple sat for a long time in stillness, the clock ticking quietly on the mantel. £200 in insurance, 300 suddenly in David's account, and a man like Abbott nervously clutching pawn tickets. Money, as so often, wound its thin threads through everything. She rose at last and took from a drawer a small notebook, worn with age. On one page she had written in neat, faded ink, Mrs. Platt, the grocer's wife, 1923. Husband's accidental, fall downstairs during air raid alarm. Everyone looking up at sky, no one looking at staircase. Beneath it, she added with calm precision, David Forrester, murder during handbell performance. Everyone looking at ringers, no one looking at vestry. It was, she felt, very much the same kind of mind at work. Her pen hovered for a moment before she wrote a final line. £300, the price of silence. But whose? Outside, the new church clock chimed 6, its measured notes spreading across St. Mary Mead. Somewhere, a murderer would hear that sound and think themselves safe. Miss Marple, listening too, knew better. People could be clever with money and alibis and keys, but human nature, in the end, was always the same. And it was human nature that interested her most. Inspector Slack, unfortunately, was moving with the comfortable assurance of a man whose mind was already made up. By the following day, Samaya. Mary Mead positively hummed with the certainty that Celia Forrester's arrest was only a matter of time. In the butcher's, in the post office, over garden fences and under drying lines, the same refrain was repeated with minor variations. She as good as admitted she hated him, Mrs. Price Ridley announced importantly near the haberdasher's window. Told Inspector Slack her marriage had been a dreadful mistake from the first. Quite enough for me. Miss Marple, comparing reels of cotton, said mildly, Many people make such remarks in moments of distress. It does not always mean they wish to murder their spouses. I recall a case in Littlehampton. But no one, at that moment, had much interest in Littlehampton. What interested Miss Marple much more was something Celia Forrester herself said that afternoon, when Miss Marple found her alone on the green, staring up at the church clock, with a strained, almost haggard intensity. It's wrong, you know, Celia said abruptly, without preamble. That clock, it's been wrong since the very beginning. Miss Marple followed her gaze. You have noticed the discrepancy too, my dear. It struck 3 before my watch showed it, Celia said. I remember, because I looked. Stupid thing to remember now, isn't it? I was wondering if David had enough time to fetch the books before the music started. She laughed, a thin, hopeless sound. And all the time he was already. She broke off, pressing her handkerchief to her mouth. And you told this to Inspector Slack? Miss Marple's tone was purely conversational. Of course I did. He said I was mistaken, that my nerves had confused things. Celia's mouth twisted. It suits everyone very well to pretend that clock is right, doesn't it? Makes their tidy little theory tidy. Sometimes, Miss Marple observed gently, it is the untidy facts one should look at most closely. Later that evening, over tea with Dolly Bantry, Miss Marple brought out her notebook and placed it beside the teapot with an air of quiet finality. You've got that look, Jane, Dolly said shrewdly. The one you had when the curate's cousin fell from that seaside cliff. And what is it you're not telling me? Merely that our dear Inspector Slack is trying very hard to fit his facts round his theory, Miss Marple replied. Whereas I have always found it better to allow theories to grow naturally from facts. At present, I have 3 that interest me very much. She ticked them off with a bony finger. First, £300 deposited in young David's account last Thursday. Second, a vestry door, very recently oiled and used, though officially kept locked. Third, a brand new church clock, already running nearly 6 minutes fast, adjusted by a man who knew precisely how much time he wished to steal. Dolly leaned forward. "You think Abbott did it, then?" "I think Mr. Abbott knows more than he has said," Miss Marple countered. "But knowledge and guilt are not always the same. There is still the question of motive. Blackmail is an untidy business, Dolly. It leaves resentments in its wake. The important thing is to discover who in St. Mary Mead had something worth £300 to keep hidden." Dolly's eyes gleamed. "And you've someone in mind?" Miss Marple hesitated. "I have a possibility, but it rests on a very small thing indeed. A remark at the post office last week, which at the time seemed of no importance." She paused, recalling the scene with photographic clarity, Mrs. Clement at the counter, flushing as she withdrew a large sum, the postmistress's sly comment about settling matters quietly. The vicar's wife's murmured, "It must never come out, not for his sake." "Until I am quite sure," Miss Marple finished calmly, "I shall remain simply an old woman who knits and listens." "People say so much, Dolly, when they believe one has stopped hearing properly." Outside, the false clock chimed the hour with misplaced confidence, its brisk notes measuring not to time, but deceit. The arrest of Celia Forrester, when it came, was almost indecently swift. By the next afternoon, Inspector Slack, armed with what he called a satisfactory chain of circumstantial evidence, had her taken into custody. The village, which had been simmering with speculation, now boiled over with certainty. "Well, that settles it, Miss Price Ridley," announced in the post office, her lips pursed with righteous satisfaction. "Such temper, such language, and that dreadful scene about the hat. You could see it in her eyes." Miss Marple, fumbling slightly with her stamps in the way that led people to underestimate her, did not contradict her. She very seldom contradicted anyone in St. Mary Mead. It was astonishing what people felt free to say in front of an elderly lady who appeared to be more concerned with the correct postage to Bournemouth. Yet that evening, as she sat alone in her parlour, the little notebook open before her, she felt a quiet but growing unease hardening into conviction. Celia Forrester might be bitter, hot-tempered, and thoroughly disagreeable. But Miss Marple had seen that young woman during the handbell performance, had marked the rigid, almost frozen posture, the way her hands twisted the hand as a cursive, while her eyes remained locked not on the vestry but on the performers. That was not the nervousness of a murderer watching the success of a plan. It was the helpless tension of someone utterly shut out of events. The second disturbance came quite literally out of the blue. At 8:30 that night, as the newly lit lamps cast long shadows across the village, a shout echoed from the direction of the church. Then came the frantic clanging of the church bell, not in measured peals, but in wild, irregular tolls that spoke of urgent alarm. Miss Marple, her shawl clutched around her, reached the churchyard just as others were converging. Dolly Bantry, breathless, Tommy Simons, white-faced, and moments later, Inspector Slack and Dr. Haydock. A small knot of people stood at the base of the clock tower, staring upward in horrified fascination. A limp figure dangled grotesquely halfway down the narrow stone stair inside the tower, visible through the open hatch. The position, the slack angle of the neck, left little doubt as to the outcome. "It's Abbott," someone whispered. "Mr. Abbott. He's hanged himself." Inside the tower, the air smelt of dust, oil, and old stone. Abbott's body had been secured to a beam with a length of bell rope. The overturned stool nearby suggested a crude and desperate final act. Inspector Slack's face bore an expression of grim satisfaction, thinly veiled by official solemnity. "Guilty conscience," he muttered to Colonel Melchett. "Saw the game was up once we started looking closer at the clock business. Blackmail, murder, and then the usual walk to a coward's way out." Dr. Haydock, examining the body, grunted no, committally. "Dead an hour at least. Neck broken, not strangled. Instant enough." Hard to say more until I've had him on the table. Miss Marple, who had followed more slowly, stood a little back from the others, her eyes roaming. They lingered on the beam, the rope, the dust on the step below the stool. Undisturbed, she noticed, except for one distinct scuff where the stool's leg had slid. In a genuine suicide, there was usually more disorder. She had learned that long ago in a case involving a farmer and a barn loft. Near Abbott's hand lay a crumpled scrap of paper. Slack pounced on it. "A note," he announced. "There we are." He smoothed it on the stone ledge, reading aloud with relish. "I cannot live with what I've done. Forgive me." Not very specific, is it?" Miss Marple remarked mildly. "One might almost think it trying to oblige." Slack shot her an impatient look. He adjusted the clock, had access to the key, owed the dead man money, and now caps it with a confession. This, Miss Marple, is what we in the force call a closed case. But Miss Marple was staring not at the note, but at the ink. It glistened unnaturally, even in the dim light of the lantern. When Slack folded the paper, the edges smudged faintly. "How very recent," she murmured. On their way out, her eye was caught by something else. A faint, oily smear on the stone near the external vestry door, precisely where a hand might reach while steadying itself. The same fresh oil Mrs. Mop had mentioned. Only now it seemed part of a much darker chain. 2 deaths, both bound to the church and its carefully manipulated time. A wife arrested, a warden conveniently confessing from beyond the grave. For Inspector Slack, the pattern was neat, even satisfying. For Miss Marple, it was altogether too neat. Human wickedness, in her long experience, seldom arranged itself in such tidy lines unless someone was deliberately drawing them that way. Miss Marple began her testing the next morning in the mildest, most unthreatening way possible, by inviting Celia Forrester to tea. Celia arrived pale and tense, her eyes shadowed as though she had slept very little. She sat on the chintz-covered chair with the stiff poise of someone expecting cross-examination and bracing to endure it. "I'm afraid I can't stay very long," she said. "Inspector Slack has made it quite clear that I'm not to leave the village." "How very inconvenient for you, my dear." Miss Marple replied gently. "Milk and sugar. I always think a proper cup of tea makes even the worst situations a little more bearable." Celia accepted the cup with a hand that trembled only slightly. After a few sips, the rigidity in her shoulders eased a fraction. "You and David had a quarrel at the post office last week," Miss Marple remarked, her tone casual. "People will always remember scenes, you know. They don't remember kindness half so well." Celia flushed. "Yes, I just found out about the money, the £300. We were barely managing as it was, and suddenly he had this sum without a word to me. When I pressed him, he said it was a private arrangement and none of my concern. I thought he'd taken it from our joint savings. We said very harsh things." "Did he mention the Clements?" "Not by name. He only said that people in positions of trust aren't always as honest as they appear. I didn't understand what he meant until after he was killed. And the inspector started asking questions about parish funds." Miss Marple let that rest, then shifted gently. "Mrs. Forrester, have you ever noticed anything odd about the church clock?" Celia's expression sharpened. "You mean besides the fact it's wrong?" "I told the inspector that on the day of the fete. He thinks I'm trying to be clever." "And yet your watch was right?" "I had it set at the post office that morning," Celia said with a flash of spirit. "Mrs. Simmons checks hers by the wireless every day at 9. The clock began striking when mine showed 3 minutes to the hour." That confirmed what Miss Marple had already surmised. Still, she offered only a mild, "Clocks and men are often unreliable, I'm afraid. One must make allowances." When Celia had gone, looking marginally less brittle, Miss Marple took a deliberate detour past the vicarage. She found Reverend Clement pacing the study, his usually composed features drawn and strained. "I have committed a grave error, Miss Marple," he said at once. as though confession were inevitable. Yesterday, I told Inspector Slack about the misappropriated funds and David's demands. He now believes I had both motive and seized opportunity. He thinks I tampered with the clock to create confusion. "Did you?" Miss Marple asked, very quietly. "Good heavens, no. I can barely manage the mantel clock in the sitting room. Abbott handled all adjustments to the tower mechanism. Did anyone else know David was planning to speak to you about the accounts on Tuesday?" Clement hesitated. Mr. Abbott knew. He was there when David first raised the matter, and David asked him to prepare the figures for our meeting. "And after that meeting, did David seem satisfied?" The vicar's gaze shifted to the window. "He left here very cheerful, almost triumphant. He said something rather odd, that he wouldn't have to worry about parish pennies much longer. At the time, I was too distressed to puzzle over it." That remark echoed in Miss Marple's mind as she walked home. Not worry about parish pennies. That suggested prospects beyond blackmail. A position, perhaps, or an inheritance. She had barely reached her gate when young Tommy Simons came running up, breathless, eyes starting. "Miss Marple, come quick. Mum sent me. It's Mr. Abbott. He's at the church. Dr. Haydock says it might be poison." In minutes, the quiet order of St. Mary Mead was thrown again into fearful agitation. In the vestry, the same cool, stone-floored room where David Forrester had died, Mr. Abbott lay slumped in a wooden chair, his skin sallow, his lips tinged an unpleasant gray. "Doctor!" Haydock straightened as Miss Marple slipped unobtrusively into the doorway. "Sleeping tablets," he muttered. "A good many of them." He left a note for Slack. Damned foolish thing to do. Inspector Slack arrived moments later, expression grim but inwardly satisfied. "A confession," he announced to the small assembly. "Abbott admits tampering with the clock at Forrester's request. Claims he didn't know about the murder plan, but couldn't live with the guilt." He waved the folded paper with a certain grim relish. Miss Marple, from a quiet place beside the vestry cupboard, watched his face carefully. "Convenient," she observed mildly. "So very convenient for everyone." Slack turned on her. "You've been hinting and suggesting all over the village, Miss Marple. Now we have it in black and white." "Perhaps," she said, her voice no more than a gentle murmur. "Or perhaps we have exactly what someone expected Mr. Abbott to write. A man in terror will sign almost anything if he's guided firmly enough." Her gaze went not to the unconscious Abbott, nor to the vicar, white-faced in the corner, but to a faint smudge of oily fingerprint on the inside of the vestry's external door, just where a guiding hand might have rested during a carefully rehearsed 3-minute passage in and out. The 3-minute window, she thought, was no isolated event. It had been used twice now, once for murder and once for something that very much resembled an attempted suicide. Unless, of course, it was meant to look like one. Miss Marple's trap began, as so many of her little enterprises did, under the appearance of harmless social routine. The following afternoon she sent out 3 notes, one to Inspector Slack, one to Dr. Haydock, and one to Reverend Clement, inviting them to a brief discussion about certain matters that trouble an old woman's mind, to be held in the vicarage study at 5:00. Dr. Haydock arrived first, as she had expected, brisk and faintly amused. "Now then, Jane," he said, dropping into a chair. "What's all this about? You look like a cat who's found the cream jug and the canary both." "It is about time, Doctor," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Time, and how easily it may be made to lie." He gave a short laugh. "Still worrying about that wretched clock? I told Slack from the beginning his precious 15 minutes was nothing but an estimate. Bodies don't come with built-in chronometers." "Very true," Miss Marple agreed. "But mechanisms do. And it is curious how, in another village I once knew, a new church clock was also used to create an illusion about the moment of death." Haydock's smile thinned slightly. "Another village? Oh, yes. Quite different people, of course. There the doctor was a very clever man, much respected. He had been altering death certificates for years, you see, to cover certain mistakes. A young clerk in the vestry began to notice irregularities in the burial register, quite by chance, of course. He thought to make a little profit from his discovery. Haydock's fingers, which had been idly tapping the chair arm, grew still. So the doctor, Miss Marple continued gently, took advantage of a public ceremony. There was music, of course, and everyone's attention directed to a particular performance. He arranged for the church clock to be set several minutes fast and persuaded an obliging church warden to adjust it with a little money and a plausible story. Then, at what everyone believed was the critical moment, he had a perfect alibi. "You do have the morbid imagination of an old spinster," Haydock said, but his tone was too sharp, his color a shade too high. "At the time," Miss Marple went on, as if she had not heard, "no one suspected him. He was, after all, the medical authority. His estimate of time of death conveniently spanned the period he required. Only, you see, he had forgotten one small thing. The clerk had mentioned to a friend, the day before, that the church clock was wrong. That one remark undid all the doctor's cleverness." Silence settled over the room like dust. Haydock stared at her, his jaw tight. "And what happened to this hypothetical clever doctor?" he asked at last. "Oh, he was hanged," Miss Marple said placidly. "They usually are, in the end. But in that case, you see, he had been careless. Here, matters are different." She looked up as footsteps sounded in the hall. "We have, after all, so much more evidence." Inspector Slack entered, followed by Reverend Clement, both wearing expressions of varying degrees of bewilderment. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "Inspector," she said, "I think it is time we considered a possibility you have overlooked. You have been quite right to examine Mrs. Forrester. The Clements, Mr. Abbott, they all had motives, but none of them had three crucial things at once: the knowledge of physiology to state a conveniently broad window of death, the position to learn of David Forrester's blackmail from several directions, and the authority to treat a new church clock as a mere mechanical toy." Slack frowned. "You're implying—" "I am suggesting," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "that David Forrester's real hold lay not merely in the parish accounts, but in what he saw in the burial register and medical certificates, entries signed by the same hand sitting across from me now." She turned her mild blue eyes on Dr. Haydock. "In my imaginary village, the doctor had been careless about one patient in particular, a woman who ought not to have died, whose family began to ask questions. Here, I think, the case must be rather similar. David was not clever enough to understand entirely, but he knew enough to threaten exposure." For the first time since she had known him, Miss Marple saw naked panic in Dr. Haydock's face. His habitual professional composure cracked. His hand went to his collar as if it were suddenly too tight. "You're talking nonsense," he said hoarsely. "Wild, vicious nonsense." "Are you quite sure," Miss Marple asked gently, "that it is nonsense, Doctor? Perhaps you would be so good as to tell us where you were at 3 o'clock. Or, if you prefer, at 7 minutes to 3 on the afternoon of the fete." The church clock outside chimed the half-hour with its false clarity. In the vicarage study, no one moved. The trap had been sprung. Now it remained to see how the creature would struggle. Inspector Slack was not immediately receptive to Miss Marple's suggestion of a little experiment, but Colonel Melchett, who had long since learned to respect the quiet old lady's instincts, overruled him with firm good sense. "If Miss Marple believes the timing is wrong, Slack, it costs nothing to let her prove it. We're not going to look foolish by checking a clock." And so, the following afternoon, several of the principal figures in the drama found themselves once more gathered near the church. Celia Forrester, pale but composed; Mrs. Clement, drawn and anxious; Mr. Abbott, looking as though he might bolt at any moment; and Reverend Clement himself, grave and outwardly controlled. "The point is very simple," Miss Marple said mildly, seated on a folding chair where she could see both the clock face and the vestry door. "We shall do what we did that day. At the moment when the clock strikes 3, the handbell ringers will begin their tune. Doctor, Haydock has kindly volunteered some village boys, and everyone will face the performance, just as before. And what exactly will that prove? Slack demanded. Only, Miss Marple replied, that the murder could not have been committed in the way you suppose, by Mrs. Forrester slipping away unseen. But perhaps, she added, it will show us how it was done. The performance began. At what the church clock claimed was 3 o'clock precisely, the makeshift handbell ringers struck up. Everyone obediently turned toward them. Miss Marple did not. She watched the vestry and, with the corner of her eye, the graveyard path. It was surprisingly instructive. Anyone moving openly across the green would have been seen at once, but a person emerging from the graveyard side, using the narrow strip of shadow along the church wall, would be easy, almost entirely screened from view, especially if the village believed the time was already past the critical moment. When the last note died away, Miss Marple consulted her own small watch, then looked up at Colonel Melchett. 2:53, she said quietly. The church clock is now 7 minutes fast, as Mr. Abbott set it on Tuesday at someone's request. The ceremony that everyone swears began at 3 o'clock actually began before the hour. In reality, there was no 3-minute window at all. There were nearly 10 minutes in which the murderer was completely unobserved. Celia stared. Then You, my dear, could not have done it, Miss Marple said firmly. Too many people saw you standing in plain sight by a clock you knew to be wrong and had complained of being wrong. It would have been madness. Her gaze moved gently, almost apologetically, to the vicar. But for someone in authority, whose presence anywhere near the church is never questioned, for someone who knew the precise arrangement of doors and keys, and who knew exactly how much the clock had been altered, it was perfectly simple. Reverend Clement's face tightened, then smoothed. Miss Marple, this is absurd. I was on the platform with the cord. The whole village saw me. Indeed. At what you believed was 3 o'clock, Miss Marple said. Not at the true hour. Before that, you had ample time to step through your unlocked study, take the external vestry key you'd already removed from its hook, slip in from the graveyard, strike David down, and return by the same way. When the manipulated clock reached the time you had planned, you merely walked out to the platform and pulled the cord. To everyone else, that was the beginning. For David, it had been the end for several minutes. Mrs. Clement gave a strangled sound. Colonel Melchett's jaw dropped. Inspector Slack turned a slow, horrified stare upon the vicar. You had more reason than anyone to silence David, Miss Marple continued gently. He had already extorted £300 over your wife's unfortunate borrowing from the parish funds. But he had found something far more serious in the records. The misdirection of the Weatherby legacy into your brother-in-law's business and the forged committee signatures to conceal it. Exposure would not merely have ruined your career, Reverend Clement. It would have sent you to prison. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, quite suddenly, the vicar laughed. Once, a short, bitter sound. You leave nothing out, do you, Miss Marple? He said quietly. Not even mercy. He did not deny it. Miss Marple began very quietly, with the smallest of nudges. That same evening, she walked to the vicarage, her step a little slower than usual, her expression one of faint, troubled concern. Reverend Clement admitted her at once. His face had that drawn, almost hollow look a man acquires when disaster has moved into the guest room and shows no intention of leaving. My dear vicar, Miss Marple said gently, I wonder if I might have a word about the matter of time. Time, he repeated blankly, motioning her to a chair. Yes, or rather, clocks. She folded her hands over her knitting bag. I have been thinking a great deal about that 3-minute window in which poor David was killed, and about your lovely new church clock, which seems to live a life quite independent of Greenwich. His gaze flickered to the mantel, where a neat little carriage clock ticked with precise dignity. "Mr. Abbott has had the greatest difficulty with the adjustment," he said wearily. "New mechanisms?" But that is just it," Miss Marple interrupted very mildly. Miss Abbott did not decide of his own accord to set it fast. He was given very precise written instructions, 7 minutes, together with money enough to clear his debt to David. Enclosed, I gather, in a plain envelope, with no signature. Clement's fingers tightened on the arm of his chair. "You have been speaking to Abbott, then?" "I have," Miss Marple agreed, "and to Mrs. Clement, and to Celia Forrester. It is remarkable how a picture forms, once one listens long enough." He tried to smile. "You always were wonderfully observant, Miss Marple." "People are so very much alike," she murmured. "One sees the same patterns, over and over. A blackmailer, for instance, so often overplays his hand. David had already extorted £300 from your wife over the parish accounts. Accounts you had, I am sure, signed in good faith. That alone would not ruin a career, with proper confession and amends. But he said something more to you on Tuesday, did he not?" Clement's eyes dropped to the worn carpet. His voice, when it came, was hoarse. "He said that the diocese would be very interested in my letter from Bishop Combermere, the one from years ago. He had found it among the old correspondence while helping with the inspection. And that letter," Miss Marple said softly, "was not authentic, was it? A youthful indiscretion. You altered a phrase, perhaps? Made a polite commendation into something like a formal endorsement, just enough to secure this living instead of a less desirable one. A small dishonesty, but one that would look very ugly if dragged into the light now." He stared at her, stunned. "How could you possibly—" "My nephew's curate once did much the same," Miss Marple said sadly. "It ended very badly for him. Young clergymen are sometimes more ambitious than honest, just like anyone else. David threatened to expose you, I think, unless you agreed to further payments, or perhaps to some more permanent arrangement on his behalf." Silence stretched between them. Outside, the falsified clock in the tower began to strike the quarter hour, clear, confident notes counting out a lie. Miss Marple leaned forward, her tone almost conversational. "You had 3 problems, Vicar. A blackmailer who had found not 1 sin but 2. A frightened wife compromised by her affection for her brother. And a village in which everyone would swear you had been standing on the platform at 3 o'clock, preparing to pull the ceremonial cord." Clement's head jerked up, eyes wide. "I was on the platform. Everyone saw me." "Oh, yes," Miss Marple agreed gently, "at 3 o'clock by the church clock. But not by the true time. You see, I have confirmed with Mrs. Simmons at the post office and with Dr. Haydock that their wireless time did not agree with your chimes. Your ceremony began 7 minutes early. Enough time for a man who knew exactly when the bells would start to slip away by the side path behind the church, into a vestry reached by a back door, whose key he kept in his own study." She watched his face very carefully then, the minute tightening at the corner of the mouth, the flicker of something, fear or fury, deep in the eyes. "You misunderstand," he began, voice rough. "Even if what you say were true—" "You came back through the graveyard," Miss Marple said quietly. "You had already instructed Abbott to falsify the clock. You knew precisely when 3 o'clock was on. You walked round, struck David with the first convenient heavy object, the candlestick, and slipped back to the platform in time for the dedication. No one looked at you closely. They were all facing the handbell ringers. And afterward, you had a very distressed wife to point to, and a very obvious history of quarrels between David and Celia to shelter behind." Clement rose abruptly, knocking his chair back. "You cannot know that," he said sharply. "You have no proof, only speculations." "Oh, but I do have a little more than that," Miss Marple said, almost apologetically. Celia Forrester remembers glancing at her watch when the clock struck 3 and noticing she had more than 2 minutes before the bells were due to start. David had not yet gone to the vestry. So the interval in which he died cannot possibly match your inspector's comfortable story of a jealous wife slipping away unseen. She drew a breath, her pale eyes very steady on his. You see, Vicar, the only person who both knew David was blackmailing you and had the authority to arrange that clock adjustment without question was you. For a long moment he stood rigid, every line of him straining against the net she had gently cast. Then something in him sagged. You don't understand, he whispered. He would have destroyed us. Not just my career, my wife, my parish, everything. For money, for amusement. He said he liked seeing how far he could push people. I understand very well, Miss Marple said softly. I have seen good men do very dreadful things when they are frightened. But fear does not prevent murder, Vicar. It explains it. There is a difference. His hands opened and closed once, twice. What will you do? I, said Miss Marple, with her faint, apologetic smile, will do nothing at all. But I took the liberty of asking Colonel Melchett and Inspector Slack to wait in the study next door. They have heard enough, I think, to do what must be done. There was the slightest rustle beyond the half-open door. Then the solid, inexorable tread of official footsteps crossing a boundary from suspicion to certainty. Outside, the church clock chimed the hour with its habitual precision, still 7 minutes fast. For the first time since its dedication, the sound made Reverend Clement flinch. In the days that followed, Mrs. Simmons' arrest sent Mary Mead settled slowly back into something resembling tranquility, though the tranquility had altered in flavor. The summa fete. Bunting had long since been taken down, the jam stall dismantled, and the handbells returned to their velvet-lined box. Yet in every sitting room and shop, the same topic was turned over and examined anew. How the quiet, precise postmistress, such a sensible woman, had proved to be a murderess of chilling calculation. Miss Marple, however, went about her routine unchanged. She took tea on the vicarage lawn, commented on chrysanthemums in Mrs. Bantry's garden, and had a long, private conversation with Dr. Haydock about sleeping powders and the foolishness of men on the brink of confession. She listened, as she always did, rather more than she spoke. It was at the vicarage, a week later, that much of the story finally settled into its proper places. The new church clock, now corrected to the proper time by a suitably chastened Mr. Abbot, chimed the half-hour with a tone that seemed less self-satisfied than before. Reverend Clement, still grey with the memory of his own brush with scandal, poured tea with exaggerated care. It is almost incomprehensible, he said slowly, that a woman could sit for 20 years behind that counter, passing out stamps and pensions, and all the while, people do remarkably unremarkable things for a very long time, Miss Marple observed mildly. And when they have done them long enough, they begin to think themselves very safe indeed. That is often the dangerous point. Mrs. Clement, looking both older and oddly lighter, gave a small shiver. If David hadn't found those discrepancies, if he hadn't started looking beyond our own accounts, he would have found something else sooner or later, Miss Marple said. Young men who discover they can profit from secrets rarely stop at one victim. He had already begun with you. Mrs. Simmons was merely the richer prize. He told Celia he had insurance of a more permanent kind. I dare say he had begun assembling quite a little dossier. The ledger that never existed, Clement murmured. Oh, I think he meant to make one, Miss Marple replied. But murder forestalled his industry. Later that afternoon, Celia Forrester came to call, looking less like a tragic heroine and more like a very young woman finally released from a nightmare. There was still sorrow in her eyes, but the hard, angry tension had gone. I wanted to thank you, Miss Marple, she said simply. Inspector Slack has, apologized in his own way. He says he doesn't like being wrong, but if he has to be wrong, he supposes it is better to be wrong before an innocent person hangs. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Inspector Slack is a very competent man within his own methods. They are just not always the right methods for villagers. Celia hesitated. Do you think I was very stupid? About David, I mean. Not seeing what he really was? My dear, young women are expected to be a little stupid in love, Miss Marple said kindly. Indeed, the world would be a chillier place if they were not. One learns. The important thing is not to learn the wrong lesson. Your husband's weakness lay in vanity and greed, not in music or charm. It would be a pity if you distrusted kindness in others, because he misused it in you. When Celia left, Miss Marple sat for some time in companionable silence with the garden birds before Dolly Bantry's energetic presence disturbed the peace. Well, Jane, it's all over bar the trial, Dolly announced, dropping into a chair. The whole village is quite turned upside down about Mrs. Simmons. To think of her, pushing out savings books and money orders all those years, whilst fiddling the accounts like a city financier. However did you land on her, and not on poor Clement or Celia or Abbott or any of the others who looked so promising? Miss Marple resumed her knitting. Because, my dear, Mrs. Simmons behaved just a little too correctly. A genuinely innocent woman in her position would have been surprised, shocked, perhaps indignant. She would not have been quite so ready with information. Celia's quarrels, Abbott's debts, the missing key. It is often the guilty person who takes the keenest interest in directing suspicion. And the clock? Dolly persisted. Such a clever idea, that 7-minute trick. I suppose that was what truly gave her away. In a sense, Miss Marple said. When Abbott spoke of the anonymous instructions and the money in his collection box, it became clear he had been used. That pointed to someone who knew 3 things: his debt to David, his access to the clock, and the precise timing of the fate program. The Clements knew the program, but not the financial details. Abbott knew the mechanism, but not all the secrets. Celia had passion, but no technical knowledge. Only Mrs. Simmons, sitting in her little office with all the villagers' letters passing through her hands, knew them all. And as postmistress, her presence anywhere about the place would rouse no comment. Dolly sighed with a kind of awed satisfaction. You make it sound so simple. Things often look simple once one has taken the trouble to understand them properly, Miss Marple said. Murder is very rarely an isolated bolt from the blue, Dolly. It grows from habits, of greed, of fear, of a certain way of looking at the world. Mrs. Simmons had been balancing figures and shaving tiny amounts for so long that, to her, altering a clock in a life may have seemed only another adjustment. On Sunday, the church was unusually full. People came as they always did after a tragedy, to reassure themselves that order still existed somewhere. The new clock, correctly set at last, chimed 3 o'clock with modest accuracy. There was no handbell performance this time, only the familiar murmur of hymns and the steady voice of Reverend Clement, speaking more simply than usual of fallibility and forgiveness. Miss Marple, in her accustomed pew, allowed her eyes to rest on the familiar faces. Mrs. Price Ridley, with sharpened curiosity slightly blunted by unease. Mr. Abbott, pale but steadier. Mrs. Clement, her hand finding her husband's arm with renewed trust. Celia, head bowed not in objection now, but in something like quiet thought. Later, walking home across the green, Miss Marple glanced up at the clock tower. Time in St. Tor, Mary Mead, had been tampered with and then restored, but it would never feel quite so unquestionable again. Yet perhaps that was not entirely a bad thing. Humans, she reflected, were very odd creatures. They imagined that by measuring minutes and hours, they could master fate itself, and yet, all the while, their real lives were governed not by clocks, but by little vanities, small deceptions and foolish fears. A village fete, a 3-minute hymn, a candlestick in a vestry. These things became instruments of murder only because human nature made them so. She reached her cottage gate and paused for a moment to deadhead a rose. In the distance, the church clock chimed the quarter hour, each note clear and precise in the mild afternoon air. This time, Miss Marple did not compare it to her own watch. 3 minutes, she murmured to herself, with the faintest of smiles. Quite long enough for mischief, or for the truth to slip through if one only listens. Then she went inside, put the kettle on, and took up her knitting once more, as calmly as if murder had never passed through St. Mary Mead, knowing full well, in her quiet, shrewd Barbisco way, that where there were people, there would always, sooner or later, be another puzzle in need of unraveling.